Of the almost 8,000 soldiers wounded at Antietam, almost all of them were sent to the city of Frederick for treatment. In the last days of September of 1862, there were just as many wounded soldiers as residents in the city. A reporter from the Philadelphia Inquirer who was visiting the city wrote, "Figuratively speaking, this city is one vast hospital, and yet hundreds of poor fellows continue to arrive who have their wounds tended to, and away they go uncomplaining." 27 buildings and 2 camps were used as hospital sites in Frederick, including all 3 public schools, all the churches except for 1 Catholic and 1 Protestant, and the old Hessian barracks, the Catholic Visitation Academy, which is now a fancy hotel, and Camp Hall. After the Battle of Antietam, over 100 ambulances arrived in the city every day. On September 27th alone, 142 ambulances delivered 800 wounded soldiers. The hospitals accepted both Union and Confederate soldiers. It was reported that 2,500 Confederates were treated in Frederick. Local resident Jacob Engelbrecht recorded in his diary the following: "Our streets are full of wounded soldiers, many of them with 1 arm off. Yesterday I met 2 on the street. One had his right arm off and the other had his left arm off. And another in company was wounded on the knee, walking with 2 crutches. If you would take a walk through the town any handsome day, you might meet 80 or 100 wounded soldiers. The majority, or rather 8/10 of them, were wounded at the Battle of Antietam. I should suppose that we have had altogether 6,000 or 8,000 wounded soldiers in our town." It wasn't until January of 1863 that the majority of the patients had been moved out of Frederick and to other hospitals, and the buildings were eventually returned to their original purpose. So this talk will focus on a few specific cases of Confederate and Federal wounded soldiers who were sent to Frederick for treatment during the Maryland Campaign 1862. The information was gathered from 2 sources: the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion, which is the official government record for the medical aspects of the Civil War, and the book that we are raffling off this evening, One Vast Hospital by Terry Reimer, which contains information on the military hospitals of Frederick, including a list of all the patients that were treated there. And I would also like to acknowledge the website Antietam on the Web for some of the photos of these soldiers. We will be looking at both the Federal and the Confederate wounded. The Confederate cases were soldiers that were captured and treated by Union medical personnel. Dr. Jonathan Letterman, the medical director of the Army of the Potomac, believed in medical care for all. As he wrote in his memoirs, quote, "Humanity teaches us that a wounded and prostrate foe is no longer our enemy," unquote. First soldier we're going to discuss is Private Samuel Altman of the 50th Georgia Infantry. Private Altman was wounded in the head at Fox's Gap on South Mountain on September 14, 1862. According to the medical and surgical history, the bullet, quote, "laid bare the frontal bone to the extent of 2 inches in length," unquote. Altman was captured by Federal soldiers and initially treated on the battlefield, and then he was sent to General Hospital No. 1 in Frederick on September 19th. The procedure known as trephination, drilling a hole in the skull, was performed on Private Altman to try to relieve pressure on his brain, but he eventually died of a brain abscess after being transferred to a general hospital in Philadelphia. He was only 21 years old. Private Michael Sullivan enlisted with the 6th Louisiana Infantry in June of 1861. He was shot 5 times during the Battle of Antietam and captured by Federal troops. He was first treated at a field hospital on the George Line Farm and then transferred to General Hospital No. 4 at the Winchester Female Seminary in Frederick. Sullivan had been shot in the knee, the left and right thighs, and the back. He had 2 fractured femurs and his legs were first placed in longboard splints. After his transfer to Frederick, both legs were placed in traction. Due to a lack of knowledge about germ theory on the part of the surgeons, Sullivan's wounds soon developed abscesses. According to records, his treatment at this time consisted of tonics and stimulants. Several pieces of bone and one mini ball were removed from his wounds, and his left leg became shorter than the right as a result. It was also noted his wounds were, quote, discharging considerable healthy pus, unquote. You might think healthy pus is an oxymoron. Well, we know it is. But Civil War surgeons did not understand pus was a sign of infection. They believed that it was a sign that the wound was in the healing process. Another bone was also removed from Sullivan's leg, and the wound was painted with tincture of iodine and a lead and opium wash. Unfortunately, Sullivan's condition did not improve, and he died on April 22, 1863, at the age of 30. James Goodrich Martin was a private in the 19th Virginia Infantry when he was wounded in the abdomen at Turner's Gap on South Mountain and then captured by Federal troops. He was admitted to General Hospital No. 1 in Frederick, and that is General Hospital No. 1, as an aside, is what we know as the Hessian Barracks today. I don't know if anybody's ever taken a tour of Frederick and seen the Hessian Barracks, but it is a famous site from the Revolutionary War that kept Hessian prisoners there during the war, and then during the Civil War it was turned into a hospital. It's got an interesting history. So James Goodrich Martin was admitted to General Hospital No. 1 in Frederick. As his wound was discharging fecal matter, the surgeons realized that his colon had been perforated. During the Civil War, most of the abdominal wounds were considered to be mortal, so it was really unusual that he received the care that he did. He was given large doses of opium, but soon developed hospital gangrene in the exit wound. Hospital gangrene was a deadly disease at the beginning of the Civil War, as surgeons didn't understand how it was transmitted, and they had no way of stopping it spreading once it infected a wound. It wasn't until later that surgeons realized that an application of bromine was found to be the best treatment. Surgeons did know to isolate gangrene patients, however, and Martin was sent to what was called the gangrene tent. His wound was cleaned and cauterized with nitric acid for 3 weeks until the gangrene was cured. Surgeons attempted to close the opening in the bowel with adhesive plasters, but only had minimal success. The bowel was clearly visible through the wound opening, but it appeared healthy. After a hemorrhage occurred, the area was syringed with cold water and filled with oakum and a solution of chlorinated soda. Martin was given tonic remedies, mainly porter and ale, and a generous diet. Doesn't sound too bad. A plug of lint was kept in the wound. Martin was transferred to Baltimore for exchange in 1863 and then sent to the Confederate hospital Chimborazo in Richmond. Records there indicate he was still having trouble with fecal matter escaping from the wound, but he was furloughed from the hospital on October 6th of 1863. His fate is not known, but it is remarkable. He survived at least a year after receiving such a grievous wound. The case of Private William Anderson Laws of the 23rd North Carolina Infantry is interesting, as he didn't die from his wounds, but from the administering of anesthesia. His case is the only known reported death from anesthesia in the city of Frederick. During the Civil War, 95% of all operations conducted used either chloroform or ether for anesthesia. The procedure had been in common use since 1846. The liquid was administered by saturating a cloth and placing it over the patient's nose and mouth. There was no exact way to measure the dosage, so the surgeons tried to operate as quickly as they could to avoid overdosing the patient. And as a result of that, they got so good at amputating, they could do an amputation in 10 to 15 minutes. So Laws was wounded in the groin at Fox's Gap on South Mountain and treated in a hospital in Middletown. He was then transferred to General Hospital 1 in Frederick on October 22nd. In addition to his wound, he was suffering from chronic diarrhea and severe bed sores that actually exposed his spine. Fragments of his pelvis, which had been fractured, needed to be removed, and surgeons decided to operate. According to the medical and surgical history, Law's heart was not examined prior to the operation. You know, today we always have an EKG and stuff to make sure our heart is healthy before we're put under. They did not do that. An account of the operation is as follows from the medical and surgical history. Chloroform was administered by acting assistant surgeon W.S. Adams on a pocket handkerchief, which was pressed firmly against the mouth of the bottle, which was then inverted. Plenty of air was given, and the handkerchief was wet with chloroform, but only once. About a minute after the administration of the chloroform was begun, almost complete relaxation in the patient was produced, and 2 labored respirations were observed. The handkerchief was immediately removed. The pulse up to this time was undisturbed. The patient then took 10 or 12 deep and rather rapid inspirations with a quickened pulse when respiration suddenly ceased altogether. The pulse continued for 6 or 8 beats, which were slower and feeble, and then suddenly ceased. Artificial respiration was immediately resorted to by Marshall Hall's ready method, which produced distinct respiration but no pulsation. Having kept it up for about 20 minutes without a result, the case was given up as hopeless. So an autopsy was performed and found no systemic problems, but found that the bullet was still embedded in Laws's pelvis. He's buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Frederick. So as a side note, they did mention Marshall Hall's ready method of resuscitation. Well, nowadays, you know, you have your regular mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and your regular EMTs know how to revive people. But back then, this was a new concept. So Dr. Marshall Hall introduced his ready method of resuscitation in the British medical journal, The Lancet, in 1856. The method called for the patient to be laid on their stomach with their forehead resting on their wrists. Hall believed laying the patient down on their stomach was enough to push the air from their lungs through the weight of their own body. Attendants would then repeatedly rock the patient onto their side. The process was to be performed until the patient was breathing on their own. I can't imagine this must work very well with Private Laws, who had a bullet in his pelvis. So we now turn to the cases of some federal soldiers, starting with Private Oliver Lewis Bell of the 1st Delaware Infantry. Bell was wounded at Antietam, shot in the groin and the knee, which fractured his leg. He was admitted to a Frederick hospital 10 days later. A splint had been badly applied to his leg with a piece of adhesive plaster placed just above the knee, and that had cut through the skin and the muscles. The plaster was removed and the leg was placed in a fracture box, like you see right there, a type of wooden cast. By December, the bones had knit together, but the leg was now 2 inches shorter. A skin infection developed, and Bell was given 3 grains of quinine every 3 hours and 15 drops of tincture of chloride of iron every 4 hours. The wound was treated with a saline solution and then that infamous lead and opium wash. Woohoo! And the limb was suspended in a splint to allow for free passage of air around it. On January 14th, an abscess on the leg was opened, and this is really gross, so block your ears. A quart of pus was drained out. A solution of zinc was applied. Laws appeared fully recovered and was discharged from the hospital in February of 1863. He then enlisted in the 1st Delaware Cavalry and served for 15 months. I mean, this guy is, you know, he was with the cavalry when his wound all of a sudden reopened, and then he was discharged for disability in June of 1865. Some of these guys, their constitutions are totally mind-blowing. Think of John Bell Gordon, too. The guy gets shot 5 times, and it's just incredible. There we go. So in 1871, here we have Private Bell in 1871. He became bedridden as his leg would no longer hold his weight. So his private physician amputated the leg 7 inches below the knee, and he felt that the leg was never actually going to heal properly, so he might as well take off the injured part. This is one of many instances where soldiers would suffer from their wounds for years afterwards and sometimes lose limbs that they originally thought could be saved. So when you say 60,000 amputations performed during the Civil War, I'm not sure if that counts the ones they did in the later years or if that only goes to 1865. Something to think about. So surgeons stationed at general hospitals often had the chance to specialize in different types of medicine. As a result, reconstructive or plastic surgery saw its beginnings during the Civil War. The case of Private William H. Blanchard of the 7th Michigan Infantry is a good example of this. Blanchard was shot through his cheeks and upper jaw at Antietam. He was first treated at a field hospital and then transferred to General Hospital No. 1 in Frederick on September 23rd. Several small pieces of bone were initially removed from the wound, and by January 1st, 1863, it had actually healed. On January 3rd, Blanchard was chloroformed, and incisions were made to free tissue that had meshed together, and sutures were made to adjust his nose. According to the medical and surgical history, quote, "The result was very satisfactory, and by January 30th, the parts had united with very little deformity," unquote. Blanchard was discharged from the hospital on February 26th, but his record states he was restricted to a soft diet for the rest of his life. And you can see he probably was covering up a lot of damage with his beard as well. The Army Medical Museum was founded during the Civil War to collect specimens to be used as medical teaching tools. The museum is now called the National Museum of Health and Medicine. If you ever get a chance to visit, it's a fascinating place. It's down in Silver Spring, Maryland. In their collection is a pelvic bone belonging to Private John Delaney of the 51st New York Infantry. Delaney was shot in the pelvis at Antietam and first treated at a field hospital. And then he was sent to one of the camp hospitals in Frederick, Camp A, one of the tent hospitals. At 41 years of age, he was much older than your average Civil War soldier. And when he arrived at Camp A, he was, quote, "greatly exhausted, and the wound discharged unhealthy pus profusely." They did distinguish between healthy and unhealthy pus. Despite this, Delaney was given stimulants and a nutritious diet and began to slowly regain his strength. By December, he was able to walk again. But unfortunately, he took a severe fall. He suffered extreme pain from a damaged sciatic nerve, and unfortunately, he died on Christmas Eve of 1862. Another bone sample in the collection of the National Museum of Health and Medicine belonged to Corporal Patrick Doyle of the 69th New York Infantry. Doyle was wounded in the right arm at Antietam by a bullet that fractured the elbow joint. He was initially treated in a field hospital and sent to General Hospital No. 5 in Frederick. As I mentioned before, over 60,000 amputations were performed during the Civil War, and as the war progressed, there was a general outcry among both the soldiers and the general public to try to reduce the number of amputations being done. A lot of the soldiers, you get the term sawbones. They call their regimental surgeon a sawbones because he was known for doing amputations that the soldiers thought were unnecessary. As a result of the protest, surgeons developed a method called resection to try to save the wounded limb. Resection consisted of cutting out the damaged part of the bone and binding the remaining two sections together. This often resulted in a shortened arm or leg with limited or no movement, but you got to keep your limb. Surgeon Henry Hewitt attempted a resection on Doyle's elbow treating the wound afterwards with yeast poultices and tincture of iodine. By December, the arm had not improved, and another resection was attempted. However, the damage was found to be too great, and it was decided to amputate the arm at the shoulder. The stump was dressed with cold water dressings, a muslin bandage that's kept wet to promote healing. By the end of December, the stump had healed, and Doyle was discharged on February 5th of 1863. His service didn't end there, however. He went on and joined the Veteran Reserve Corps, or what is known as the Invalid Corps, until he was finally discharged on December 9th of 1864. Another soldier had a resection of his arm was Private John P. Hastings of the 19th Indiana Infantry. During the fighting at Turner's Gap, he was shot in the left forearm and his elbow was shattered. He was sent to Frederick's General Hospital No. 1, and surgeons decided to try a resection of his arm. Several operations were conducted, and they successfully removed bone from his upper and lower arm. His arm was placed in a wire splint to prevent movement of the elbow. According to records, this allowed him to, quote, leave his bed and go outdoors, unquote. In December, doctors reported that he had, quote, pretty good motion in the fingers, unquote. After the wire splint was removed, it was found that the shoulder joint was stiff from being confined for so long. They didn't know about PT back then, I guess. By February, it was reported that the motion in the arm was good. The patient was able to actually bring it up to his mouth. He was discharged on February 6th with his left arm. It's now 2 inches shorter than his right. He never actually regained total use of the arm despite the initial positive reports. A surgeon examined Hastings for his pension application in 1873 and said, there is very little motion at the resected point, the elbow, and the arm is flexed nearly at a right angle. The biceps and tricep muscles are much atrophied. The disability is equivalent to the loss of an arm and is permanent. Unfortunately, Hastings wouldn't live a long life with his disabled arm. He would die at the age of 34 in 1875. I think a lot of these resections would have worked better if they had understood about physical therapy and keeping you moving and so the muscles didn't atrophy. But unfortunately, that was way in the future. Private Matthew Hartigan of the 108th New York Infantry was 18 years old when he was shot at Antietam, the ball passing through the joint of the left knee and striking the femur and tibia. What is remarkable is that after being wounded, Hartigan walked from the battlefield to a field hospital. Ouch. He was then transferred to Frederick, where the wound began to heal, but he was also suffering from diarrhea, poor appetite, and was emaciated, as were probably a lot of the soldiers suffering from diarrhea before they were even wounded. Abscesses then formed on his wound, and according to the medical and surgical history, quote, the least movement of the limb would cause the most agonizing pain. Hartigan's appetite totally disappeared, and his emaciation started to increase. In order to save his life, it was determined that an amputation of the limb was the only solution. It's recorded that the method used to amputate was the flap method, and this consisted of leaving flaps of skin around the severed bone and folding them over to cover the area once the leg is amputated. The skin would then knit together and create a stump. This was actually a very common form of amputation used by surgeons during the war, and it was generally very successful. If a patient was going to die, it usually wasn't from the amputation operation, it was usually from the infection that resulted afterwards. By December, the stump had almost completely healed, and Hartigan had recovered his health. He was discharged from service in May of 1863 and supplied with an artificial limb from the Palmer Arm and Leg Company. The prosthetic limb industry saw many advances during the Civil War because, of course, thousands of amputations, so there's a need there. James Hanger, a private in the Confederate Army, had his left leg taken off by a cannonball at the Battle of Philippi in Western Virginia on June 3rd of 1861. Hanger, who'd been an engineer in his private life, decided he was going to design his own prosthetic leg with movable joints at the knee and the ankle and rubber bands for tendons. It became quite popular. Then he had some buddies coming home with missing arms. And they were saying, hey, we really like the leg you designed. Can you design an arm for us? And so he did. And the Confederate government soon asked Hanger to supply prosthetics to a lot of Confederate veterans coming home. So he founded his own company, the Hanger Company. It's still in business today, providing prosthetics. So you Google Hanger Company, you'll see it's still in business. And the prosthetics that they make now are a lot more advanced than that. And so you have amazing double amputees able to run marathons. It's incredible. So another soldier who benefited from the Army's prosthetic limbs program was Private Jared Wheeler, who joined the 8th Connecticut Infantry on September 25th of 1861. During the Battle of Antietam, as part of Rodman's division, the 8th forded Antietam Creek to attack the Confederates' right flank. Wheeler was shot in the right ankle and taken to a field hospital where his entire leg was amputated. He was then sent to General Hospital Camp B in Frederick. That's one of the tent hospitals. And then he also was eventually moved to General Hospital number 6 on December 5th and General Hospital 1 on February 9th. He was getting a real tour of all the hospitals. He then received a furlough and was readmitted to a hospital in Connecticut and then to a Central Park hospital in New York, and eventually discharged for disability on November 17, 1863. He was fitted with an artificial leg. Soldiers who lost a limb during the war usually did receive extra funds in their military pensions for the purchase of prosthetics, and Wheeler actually made good use of his and would live until 1922. So not all soldiers sent to Frederick had been wounded by bullets. While the number of injuries caused by artillery is significantly lower, the wounds caused by artillery rounds were often more severe. A case in point is Sergeant James Hines of the 83rd New York Infantry. Hines was a 28-year-old Irish immigrant when his regiment took part in the first attack of the day at Antietam. Like many Federal units in Hooker's 1st Division, Hines and his comrades came under withering artillery fire from Confederate guns. A piece of shell struck Hines in the left shoulder, tearing away the outer half of his collarbone and breaking his shoulder blade. He was evacuated to General Hospital 1 in Frederick, where surgeons applied dressings to the wound. Luckily for Hines, the shoulder joint itself had not been injured. On October 12th, a Dr. Gordon Buck of New York, while inspecting the hospital, took an interest in Hines' case and advised that he could perform an operation that would improve the shoulder. After giving Hines a dose of either, of course, anesthesia was used, Dr. Buck removed the outer part of the shoulder blade using a chainsaw. Now, when we say chainsaw today, we think of something a little bit different, but they did have chainsaws back then that they used for surgery, but they were hand cranked. This surgical instrument operated on the same principle as a modern chainsaw, but a lot smaller. It was operated by turning a crank, which would move the chain and the cutting edge. It was often used to remove large bits of bone that could not be accessed by a regular-sized bone saw. After removing the bone in the shoulder blade, the surgeon then bound the bones together using iron wire sutures. The forearm was bent at a right angle with the arm and was raised to the shoulder level and fixed in a position using a splint. The surgery was a success and the wound did heal. However, Hines' arm was never fully recovered, and he did suffer some paralysis in it. But nevertheless, they're still trying not to do amputations and trying to use some new technology here. Corporal Asa Taylor was another soldier from the 83rd New York, wounded at Antietam. A bullet entered the right side of his neck just below the skull and fractured his lower jaw and took out several teeth. The bullet continued through his palate and knocked out 2 of his front teeth before exiting below his left nostril. He was sent to Frederick General Hospital I on September 24th. He was unable to speak, but did not have any fever. A bandage was applied to his fractured jaw with plaster dressings, and he was put on a liquid diet. Eventually, he did regain his voice. He progressed to a soft diet and was discharged in December of 1862, quote, doing well in all respects, unquote, according to reports. This is a remarkable recovery considering most head and facial wounds in the Civil War were considered mortal. But again, I think he was also benefiting from the advent of reconstructive surgery that was just beginning during the Civil War. Private Morris Ward enlisted with the 63rd New York Infantry at age 32. During the Battle of Antietam, he shot twice in the back. The first bullet entered between the 8th and 9th ribs on the left side. The second entered in the lower spinal area and lodged in the gluteal muscles. He was first treated at the 2nd Corps Field Hospital where water dressings were applied. I want to make a note. I talk about they were first treated at field hospitals. You may know about the Letterman plan that was put in use here at Antietam for the first time. Consisted of field dressing stations and field hospitals that were right on the battlefield or very close by. And then stage 3 was going to a general hospital. So the soldiers would have already received care before they actually got to the city of Frederick. So this fellow went to the 2nd Corps Field Hospital and got some water dressings applied. On September 30th, he got sent to Frederick. He was not complaining of any pain in his chest, but surgeons could feel a bullet just under the skin beneath his nipple. Due to his weak condition, it was decided to leave the bullet in place rather than to try and remove it. Poultices were prescribed and a tube placed in the wound to facilitate drainage. On October 13th, Ward expectorated a small amount of blood and complained of pain in his chest. Surgeons found a tumor developing, extending from the left nipple inward for 2 inches. On listening to Ward's chest, quote, a sound was heard resembling the passage of air with a small quantity of liquid through a slight opening, unquote. The tumor continued to increase in size, and Ward died on October 17th. An autopsy found that a round ball had passed underneath the lungs and was resting up against the diaphragm. Pieces of uniform had been carried into the diaphragm along with the ball and caused an infection, eventually causing a tumor and death. This is one of the medical problems with Civil War gunshot wounds that surgeons had to deal with. Because of the slow velocity of the projectile, clothing, hair, dirt, skin from other bodies that it passed through were brought into the wound, which increased the risk of infection. Sergeant Herrick Hodges enlisted for the second time on May 29, 1862 in the 17th Michigan Infantry. He previously enlisted in a New York regiment, was discharged for disability in October 1861. As part of the regiments on the right flank of the 9th Corps, during the final hours of the Battle of Antietam, the 17th Michigan was subjected to intense fire from Confederates on Cemetery Hill. It was during the charge on the hill that Hodges was shot in the left calf. As he was being carried from the field, another bullet pierced his left chest, passed through a rib, and lodged in his lung. Unable to be moved to Frederick right away, he was treated in one of the many field hospitals sent up around the battlefield until October 3rd, when he was well enough to be transferred to Frederick, to Camp B, one of the tent hospitals. Again, most wounds to the chest were considered mortal by Civil War surgeons. They were conducting what we call today triage. They were sorting out the wounded. This was a brand new concept for the Civil War. So any wound to the head, chest, or abdomen area was considered mortal and was not given priority care. But as we have seen, sometimes these guys do survive. So There was no attempt to remove the bullet from Hodges' lung. Beating the odds, he survived and was discharged from duty on June 1st of 1863. A February 12, 1864 pension report states that, quote, the ball still remains in the chest, causing functional disturbance of the heart, pain and prostration, unquote. But couldn't have been too disabling because after the war, Hodges held various jobs, including town clerk and librarian, and he lived until 1913, which is incredible with a ball in your chest. Finally, our museum recently became aware of the case of Sergeant Thomas Conant, Jr. of the 29th Massachusetts Infantry. Conant was an 18-year-old student when he mustered in as a sergeant in Company C on May 22, 1861. His first wounding occurred at the Battle of Savage's Station in Virginia on June 29, 1862, but he was recovered enough to participate in the Battle of Antietam on September 17th, lucky him, where he was wounded slightly in the foot during the fighting at the Sunken Road with the famous Irish Brigade. Conant was taken to Philip Pry's house near the Antietam battlefield. The Pry house had been commandeered as a field hospital and as the headquarters for Union Army Medical Director Jonathan Letterman. 2 Union generals were treated there, you probably know this, General Joseph Hooker, General Israel Richardson, and Richardson would die in the upstairs bedroom on November 3rd, 1862. 500 private soldiers would be treated in the barn before being sent to hospitals in Frederick. And one of these that was treated was Sergeant Conant. Conant writes in his diary about his experience after the Battle of Antietam. He writes, having just recovered from a slight wound in the foot, received in the memorable Battle of Antietam, I left the large barn on the estate of Mr. Pry, which on account of its nearness to the battlefield had been converted into a hospital. I had the hope of being able before night to join my regiment at Harper's Ferry. I found my foot much better able to climb the hills than I had dared to anticipate. I really enjoyed my solitary march after being confined at the hospital for a fortnight. The limp in my gait and a bullet hole in my shoe had brought on inquiries from an old man, which resulted in my giving him a short history of my misfortune. Whereupon he went into the cottage, and in a tone loud enough so I could overhear it, he related to his family the case of the poor soldier who was wounded at the Battle of Antietam and had now stopped on his way to rejoin his regiment to rest and refresh himself under an apple tree in their dooryard. Conant's story is of particular interest to our museum, since you probably heard in Miriam's introduction, we operate the Pry House Field Hospital site for the National Park Service. I am the site manager there. One of Conant's descendants actually came to the Pry House and contacted us and said, hey, you might be interested in this story because my ancestor was treated here in the barn. And we have all of this documentation. And we also have the part of the shoe that he cut out, and that's where the bullet hole in his shoe was. So he saved the bullet hole in his shoe for a souvenir. So that was loaned to us, as well as parts of his diary and his photograph. So we love it when these really unknown stories come forward like this, and we can highlight them. So while Antietam was the bloodiest single day in American history, with over 23,000 casualties, it was also the first time that new ideas in medical treatment for the wounded were implemented. Dr. Jonathan Letterman's Ambulance Corps, which was founded only 1 month before the battle in August, was able to take most of the wounded off the battlefield within 48 hours. The new concept of field hospitals allowed for immediate treatment of the wounded, which increased a soldier's survival rate. In addition, general hospitals established in nearby Frederick by Dr. Letterman prior to the battle were able to provide additional care and a temporary haven for those patients who needed a longer recuperation time. While some of the soldiers discussed here unfortunately did not survive, they still benefited from a new system that provided care for them and eased their suffering as soon as possible. And thank you for your attention.